Maybe you should keep your advice to yourself, Margaret. Nobody does things your way anymore." The words landed in the middle of the room like a dropped glass, and for a moment, even the soft piano music coming from the speakers seemed to disappear. I remember standing there with a paper cup of sparkling water in my hand, smiling as though I hadn't heard them at all. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 71 years old that spring, and the engagement party for my grandson was supposed to be one of the happiest days our family had shared in years. Instead, it became the day I finally understood who my daughter-in-law really was. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know where you're listening from, because what happened next changed the way I looked at family forever. The party was being held in a beautiful event hall just outside Columbus, Ohio. White flowers lined the tables. Warm lights hung from the ceiling. The scent of fresh baked rolls drifted from the catering station. Everywhere I looked, people were laughing, taking pictures, and celebrating the young couple's future. I had spent nearly 2 hours getting ready that morning. I chose a navy blue dress, carefully pinned my silver hair back, and wore the pearl earrings my late husband had given me on our 40th anniversary. I wanted to look my best, not for attention, just because family occasions still meant something to me. Earlier that afternoon, my grandson had asked me what I thought made a marriage last. It was a sweet question, one I answered from the heart. I simply told him that kindness mattered more than being right, and that listening was often more important than speaking. Several guests nodded politely. Then Vanessa laughed. Not a warm laugh. Not the kind that invites others to join in. It was sharp, deliberate, designed to be heard. "That advice worked in the 70s, Margaret," she said. "People actually have standards now." A few nervous chuckles followed. Some guests looked down at their plates. Others pretended to be interested in their phones. My son Daniel stood only a few feet away. He heard every word. He said nothing. I smiled. I took a small sip of water. Then I sat down. The conversation moved on as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something important. For years, I had convinced myself that Vanessa's comments were misunderstandings. Bad timing. Personality differences. Little things not worth mentioning. Yet as I watched her move through the room that evening, accepting compliments and greeting relatives with practiced charm, a strange feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. Like finally seeing a picture come into focus after years of looking at it through fogged glass. I noticed how she glanced toward me after each joke. I noticed how quickly she changed expressions whenever someone important approached. I noticed how naturally she controlled every conversation around her. Most of all, I noticed how comfortable she seemed after humiliating me in front of people who had known me for decades. That was when I remembered the phone call I'd received 3 days earlier. A phone call I hadn't told anyone about. A phone call from someone connected to my late husband's financial affairs. At the time, I thought it was strange. By the end of that party, I realized it might explain everything. While the guests continued celebrating, I sat quietly at my table and watched Vanessa raise a champagne glass across the room. She looked confident. Victorious, even. What she didn't know was that 3 days earlier, a secret had landed in my lap. And before long, that secret was going to change all of our lives. I remained at the engagement party for another hour after Vanessa's comment, although every instinct told me to leave. Instead, I sat quietly near the back of the room, watching families take photographs beneath the floral arch while servers carried trays of appetizers from table to table. The celebration continued as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the part that stayed with me the most. Not Vanessa's words. Not even Daniel's silence. It was how easily everyone moved on. Years ago, I would have convinced myself that I was being too sensitive. I would have found excuses for everyone involved. But age has a way of stripping away comforting illusions. By 71, I had learned that when people repeatedly show you who they are, believing them is not cruelty. It is wisdom. As I watched my family mingle, memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments. Forgettable moments. At least that was what I had called them at the time. 3 years earlier, I had arrived at my granddaughter Emma's school performance only to discover that the event had started an hour earlier than the time Vanessa had given me. I missed the entire show. Vanessa apologized with a smile and blamed a scheduling mix-up. The following Christmas, I learned that a family dinner had been moved to a different restaurant at the last minute. Everyone received the update except me. Again, Vanessa apologized. Again, I accepted it. Then there was Mother's Day. Daniel called late in the evening and explained that plans had become complicated. I spent that holiday alone, eating takeout Chinese food while scrolling through photographs that later appeared online. Photographs showing a large family brunch attended by nearly everyone I loved. Everyone except me. At the time, each incident seemed isolated. A misunderstanding, bad communication, human error. Sitting at that engagement party, I began seeing them differently, like pieces of a puzzle finally sliding into place. The drive home that night took nearly 40 minutes. Rain tapped softly against my windshield as I followed the highway through the darkness. I kept replaying the afternoon in my mind. Vanessa's expression, Daniel avoiding eye contact, the uncomfortable silence around the room. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with age. My small brick house felt unusually quiet when I stepped inside. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and turned on the light above the stove. Family photographs covered one wall. Pictures from birthdays, graduations, vacations, and anniversaries. Decades of memories frozen behind glass. I studied them for a long moment. In nearly every photograph, I saw myself smiling beside people I had supported, encouraged, and loved. Yet lately, that smile seemed to belong to someone else. Someone who still believed loyalty was always returned. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table. That was when my eyes landed on a business card lying beside the fruit bowl. The card belonged to Richard Holloway, the financial advisor who had managed several matters for my late husband before his passing. 3 days earlier, he had called unexpectedly and asked if we could meet in private. At the time, he sounded concerned but careful. He refused to discuss details over the phone. Looking at that card now, I felt the same uneasy sensation I had experienced at the party. The feeling that something important had been hidden from me for a very long time. And for the first time, I was ready to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, I called Richard Holloway and agreed to meet him at a small cafe on the east side of town. The place sat between a bookstore and a florist, quiet enough for conversations people did not want overheard. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window. Outside, the sky was gray, and a light breeze carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk. Inside, the smell of coffee and cinnamon filled the air. Richard arrived exactly on time. He was in his late 60s, neatly dressed, carrying a leather portfolio that looked as though it had traveled through decades of meetings. After we exchanged greetings, he sat down and folded his hands carefully on the table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked directly at me and said something that immediately tightened the knot already sitting in my stomach. He asked if I had recently reviewed the family trust documents my husband had established before his passing. I told him I had not. After my husband died 4 years earlier, I handled only what was necessary. Most of the paperwork had been organized by professionals I trusted. Richard nodded slowly, as though he expected that answer. He opened the portfolio and removed several folders. Nothing about his movements felt dramatic. In fact, that made the situation even more unsettling. Calm people rarely deliver life-changing information with raised voices. They simply place the truth on the table and let it speak for itself. Richard explained that while conducting a routine review, he had noticed a series of requests involving family financial records. Some requests were ordinary, others were unusual. He stressed that nothing illegal had occurred. However, he believed certain individuals had shown an unusual level of interest in assets they did not currently control. I listened carefully. The names he mentioned were not surprising. Daniel's name appeared several times. Vanessa's appeared even more often. My fingers tightened slightly around my coffee cup. Richard continued speaking in the measured tone of someone discussing weather patterns rather than family relationships. Over the previous 18 months, questions had been raised regarding property valuations, trust distributions, future inheritance structures, and long-term care arrangements. Individually, each inquiry seemed harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. I felt strangely calm as he spoke, perhaps because part of me had already suspected something was wrong. The engagement party had not created the problem. It had simply exposed it. Richard slid one document across the table. On its own, the paper meant very little. But the date caught my attention. It had been filed less than 3 weeks earlier. Around the same time, Vanessa had started making subtle comments about retirement communities, simplifying finances, and preparing for the future. At the time, those conversations sounded practical. Sitting in that cafe, They sounded calculated. Richard was careful not to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. He simply encouraged me to become more informed about matters affecting my own future. Before we left, he handed me copies of several records and suggested I review them privately. As I gathered the documents, a memory surfaced from years earlier. My husband had once told me that character revealed itself most clearly when people believed no one was paying attention. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he had been talking about family. Walking back to my car, I looked down at the folder tucked beneath my arm. For the first time in years, I stopped, asking whether I was imagining things. The real question was no longer whether something was happening behind my back. The real question was how long it had been happening before I finally noticed. That afternoon, I spread the documents across my dining room table and began reading them one page at a time. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the polished wood surface where my husband and I had shared countless meals over the years. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I used to find that sound comforting. On that day, it felt like a reminder of how much time had passed while I was looking the other way. The records themselves were not dramatic. There were no shocking confessions or obvious betrayals written in black ink. Instead, there were patterns, dates, requests, notes, conversations summarized in professional language. The more I read, the more I noticed the same names appearing repeatedly. Daniel, Vanessa, Daniel, Vanessa, sometimes separately, often together. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Memories surfaced with surprising clarity. 5 years earlier, when Daniel and Vanessa bought their house, I had contributed a substantial amount toward the down payment. They insisted it was only temporary help. I never asked for repayment. 2 years later, when unexpected repairs threatened to overwhelm their budget, I wrote another check without hesitation. Then came childcare, school pickups, weekend babysitting, holiday preparations. Every time they needed support, I gave it willingly because that was what family meant to me. Looking back, I realized something unsettling. Gratitude had become increasingly rare. The requests never stopped, but the appreciation slowly disappeared. I remembered one Thanksgiving when I spent nearly 12 hours cooking. Vanessa arrived late, glanced at the table, and immediately criticized the seating arrangement. Another time, I offered to help organize a family reunion. Vanessa thanked me publicly but quietly replaced nearly every decision I made. At the time, I told myself she simply preferred being in control. Now I wondered whether control had always been the point. As evening approached, I opened an old cedar chest in the guest room. Inside were photo albums, greeting cards, and letters collected over decades. I found a birthday card my husband had written shortly before he passed away. His handwriting was slightly uneven, but every word remained unmistakably his. One sentence caught my attention. He had written that kindness was valuable, but only when paired with clear eyes and strong boundaries. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that card for several minutes. My husband had always been an excellent judge of character. He noticed details most people overlooked. Suddenly, I found myself wondering how much he had seen before he was gone. That evening, Emma called unexpectedly. My granddaughter rarely phoned without a reason, so I answered immediately. We spoke about ordinary things at first. Her job, her apartment, her upcoming travel plans. Yet something in her voice sounded hesitant, as though she wanted to say more than she felt comfortable saying. Finally, after a long pause, she asked whether I was all right after the engagement party. The question surprised me. Most family members had acted as though nothing unusual happened. Emma had noticed. I assured her I was fine, but she did not sound convinced. Before ending the call, she said something that stayed with me long after we hung up. She told me that sometimes people mistake patience for weakness. Then she added that not everyone in the family saw things the way Vanessa did. After the call ended, I sat alone in the quiet house and stared at the documents spread across the table. For the first time in years, I felt something shifting inside me. Not anger, not revenge, something steadier than that. Awareness. The kind that arrives when excuses finally run out and the truth no longer asks for permission to be seen. 2 days later, Emma asked if we could have lunch together. We met at a small cafe overlooking the river, a place where college students studied for exams and retirees lingered over coffee. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the water, and for a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. Her work, a book she was reading, a trip she hoped to take someday. Yet I could tell she had not invited me there for small talk. Emma kept stirring her iced tea long after the ice had melted. Finally, she set down her glass and looked directly at me. There was concern in her eyes, but also determination. She reminded me so much of her grandfather in that moment that it nearly took my breath away. She did not rush into the subject. Instead, she carefully asked whether I had noticed how often conversations about my future seemed to happen without me. The question lingered between us. I told her I had begun noticing a few things. Emma nodded slowly. Then she shared something that changed the way I viewed the previous year. According to Emma, discussions about retirement communities, property management, and long-term planning had become surprisingly common whenever Vanessa was around. At first, Emma assumed they were ordinary family conversations. Over time, however, the tone changed. Decisions were being discussed before anyone spoke to me. Assumptions were being made about what I would eventually do with my home. Emma admitted that hearing those conversations always made her uncomfortable. What disturbed her most was how confidently certain people spoke, as though outcomes had already been decided. I listened quietly. Outside the cafe window, a jogger passed along the river path. A boat drifted slowly downstream. Life continued normally while my understanding of my own family shifted beneath my feet. Emma hesitated before continuing. Then she told me about a conversation she had overheard several weeks earlier. Vanessa had been speaking with friends after a charity event. She was describing future plans, discussing renovations, investments, and lifestyle changes. At one point, someone asked how those plans would be funded. Vanessa laughed and said that certain family assets would eventually solve a lot of problems. Emma never forgot the comment. Neither did I. The statement itself was vague. Yet paired with everything else, it carried weight. More importantly, Emma was not sharing gossip. She was sharing concern. That difference mattered. Throughout our conversation, she never sounded angry. She sounded protective. Before we left, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me something no one else in the family had said for a very long time. She said I deserved respect. Not because of money. Not because of property. Simply because I was family. The words stayed with me during the drive home. That evening, I walked through my house more slowly than usual. I noticed the framed photographs lining the hallway. The garden visible through the kitchen window. The worn armchair where my husband used to read every evening. Every corner held memories earned through decades of work, sacrifice, and love. For years, I had worried about preserving harmony. I had remained patient, understanding, flexible. But standing there in the quiet house, I realized something important. Harmony built on silence is not harmony at all. It is surrender. For the first time, I stopped asking how to avoid conflict. Instead, I began asking a different question. If people were already making plans for my future, what would happen when they discovered I intended to make my own? The following week, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped offering solutions before anyone asked. Most importantly, I stopped rescuing people from the consequences of their own choices. It was not a dramatic change. No one would have noticed it from the outside. Yet the effect was immediate. For years, I had been the person everyone called when they needed something. Advice, money, childcare, last-minute help. If a problem appeared, I quietly stepped forward. When I stepped back, even slightly, the reactions began almost immediately. Daniel called one Tuesday evening while I was watering flowers on my back patio. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he mentioned that he and Vanessa were considering some expensive home improvements. Normally, I would have listened carefully and offered encouragement. Instead, I simply wished them luck and changed the subject. There was a brief silence on the line. Not long enough to sound rude, just long enough to sound surprised. A few days later, Vanessa invited me to lunch. The invitation itself felt unusual. In recent years, most communication came through group messages or family gatherings. During lunch, she was exceptionally pleasant. She complimented my blouse, asked about my garden, even inquired about a book I had recently finished reading. On the surface, the conversation seemed warm. Yet beneath every topic, I sensed a purpose. Eventually, the discussion drifted toward future planning. Vanessa spoke about simplifying life, reducing responsibilities, and making smart decisions before problems appeared. Her tone remained cheerful, professional almost. Then she casually mentioned how difficult large homes could become for older people. I smiled and took a sip of iced tea. Instead of agreeing, I told her I still enjoyed maintaining my home. The disappointment that flickered across her face lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Later that evening, I thought about the conversation while folding laundry. What struck me was not what Vanessa said. It was how carefully she avoided asking what I actually wanted. Every suggestion focused on what others believed would be best for me. No one seemed interested in whether I agreed. The pattern became easier to see once I stopped ignoring it. Over the next several days, I quietly reviewed more documents and organized notes from my meetings with Richard. I created a folder and placed everything inside. Dates, conversations, financial records. Nothing extraordinary on its own. Together, however, they formed a picture I could no longer dismiss. Meanwhile, family conversations grew increasingly curious. Daniel suddenly wanted to discuss long-term plans. Vanessa frequently mentioned efficiency and convenience. Several relatives asked questions that seemed oddly specific about my property and finances. I answered politely but briefly. The less information I provided, the more uncomfortable certain people appeared. That realization taught me something valuable. People who genuinely care about you become curious about your well-being. People who care about what you own become curious about your assets. One afternoon, while organizing old photographs in the living room, I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. Not because the situation was improving. It was not. The smile came from clarity. For years, confusion had drained my energy. Clarity restored it. I no longer felt compelled to explain every instinct or dismiss every concern. The facts were beginning to speak for themselves. And somewhere beyond those facts, a larger truth was waiting. The only question remaining was how far certain people were willing to go before they realized I was paying attention. About 2 weeks later, the conversation I had been expecting finally arrived. Daniel called on a Sunday afternoon and asked whether he and Vanessa could stop by the house. His voice sounded unusually careful. Not nervous exactly, but rehearsed. I agreed and spent the next hour tending to my roses before they arrived. The late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard, casting long shadows over the flower beds my husband and I had planted years ago. By the time their car pulled into the driveway, I already knew this visit was not about family. It was about strategy. Vanessa entered carrying a bakery box and wearing one of her brightest smiles. Daniel followed behind her, holding coffee cups. To anyone watching from outside, they would have looked like a thoughtful son and daughter-in-law stopping by to spend quality time together. We sat in the living room and exchanged pleasantries. We discussed the weather, Emma's upcoming travel plans, local traffic. Every topic felt strangely weightless, as though we were all walking around the real reason for the visit. Eventually, Vanessa set down her coffee and leaned forward slightly. Her expression softened into concern. At least that was the expression she intended to project. She began talking about the future, about simplifying life, about reducing stress, about making smart choices before difficult decisions became necessary. I listened quietly. Daniel nodded along as though he had heard the speech several times already. Then Vanessa mentioned my house. She praised its charm before explaining how much work a property this size could become for someone in their 70s. She spoke about maintenance, safety, and convenience. Every sentence sounded reasonable when viewed alone. Together, they sounded like a sales presentation. When she finished, Daniel added that they simply wanted what was best for me. I smiled and thanked them for their concern. Then I asked a simple question. Had either of them spoken with me recently about what I actually wanted for my future? The room grew noticeably quieter. Daniel looked down at his cup. Vanessa recovered first. She explained that they were only trying to help. The answer did not address the question. I noticed that immediately. So did they. For the next 30 minutes, the conversation circled the same themes. Planning, efficiency, responsibility. Yet beneath every carefully chosen phrase, I sensed something else. Expectation. They were not discussing possibilities. They were discussing outcomes they had already imagined. The realization did not anger me. Instead, it confirmed everything I had been observing. Before leaving, Vanessa casually mentioned that a family gathering was being organized the following month. Several relatives would attend. Friends of the engaged couple would be there as well. She encouraged me to come because it would be a wonderful opportunity for everyone to discuss important matters together. The invitation sounded harmless, yet something in her tone suggested otherwise. After they left, I stood at the front window and watched their car disappear around the corner. Then I returned to the dining room table where my folders remained neatly organized. For several minutes, I reviewed the notes I had collected over the previous weeks. The patterns were impossible to ignore now. Every road seemed to lead toward the same destination. What surprised me was not that people wanted influence. Human nature had not changed. What surprised me was how certain they seemed that I would never notice. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I closed the folder and turned off the dining room light. The gathering Vanessa mentioned was still weeks away. She believed it would be an opportunity to guide the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. What she did not realize was that I intended to attend for the very same reason. The weeks leading up to the gathering passed quietly on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything was changing. Each morning, I followed the same routine. Coffee by the kitchen window, a short walk through the neighborhood, time spent tending the garden. To anyone looking in from the outside, my life appeared completely ordinary. That illusion worked in my favor. People rarely notice someone they believe they have already figured out. Meanwhile, I continued meeting with Richard. During our second meeting, he explained several details that had been overlooked for years. My husband had been far more thorough than I realized when organizing our estate. Certain protections existed within the trust structure. Certain conditions had been carefully documented. None of it was hidden exactly, but most people never bothered reading beyond the summaries. My husband always believed that important decisions should reward responsibility rather than entitlement. Sitting across from Richard, I found myself smiling at how well he understood human nature. The more I learned, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. Many assumptions were being made about assets that no one actually controlled. At least not yet. That realization changed everything. Instead of feeling anxious, I felt prepared. Around the same time, conversations with family members became increasingly revealing. An aunt asked whether I had considered downsizing. A cousin mentioned retirement communities she had heard good things about. Daniel called twice in 1 week to discuss future planning. None of these interactions sounded suspicious by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to miss. Everyone seemed interested in where I might live 5 years from now. Very few seemed interested in how I was living today. One afternoon, Emma stopped by unexpectedly carrying 2 cups of coffee. We sat on the back patio watching birds move between the trees. She asked whether I was nervous about the upcoming gathering. I surprised both of us by answering honestly. No, I was not nervous. Months earlier, I would have been. Back then I still worried about keeping everyone comfortable. Now I was more interested in understanding the truth. Emma smiled when she heard that. Then she shared another observation. According to her, Vanessa had been unusually confident lately, almost celebratory. She seemed convinced that several important conversations were about to go exactly as planned. Hearing that did not upset me. In fact, it confirmed something I had already suspected. Confidence often becomes dangerous when it is built upon assumptions. A few days before the event, I received a package from Richard containing copies of finalized documents and supporting records. I placed them carefully inside a leather folder and locked them in my desk drawer. I did not intend to use them immediately. Their value came from patience. Sometimes the strongest position is not the one that speaks first. It is the one that waits until everyone else has finished talking. The evening before the gathering, I walked through my house turning off lights one room at a time. The familiar routine felt strangely meaningful. For the first time in years, I did not feel like someone reacting to circumstances created by others. I felt like someone making her own choices. As I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Vanessa reminding everyone about the event schedule. The note ended with cheerful enthusiasm and several smiling emojis. I read it once, then set the phone aside. Tomorrow, she expected another audience. Another opportunity to direct the conversation. Another chance to demonstrate control. What she did not know was that the story she planned to tell was about to collide with facts she had never bothered to learn. The gathering was held at a country club just outside the city, the kind of place where polished floors reflected the afternoon sunlight, and every table seemed arranged for a photograph. When I arrived, guests were already mingling near the terrace. Conversations drifted through the room. Laughter rose and fell. Servers moved quietly between groups, carrying trays of refreshments. Vanessa stood near the center of it all, greeting people with effortless confidence. From a distance, she looked completely at ease. Daniel remained close beside her. Watching them together, I was reminded of how powerful assumptions can become when they go unchallenged. I took my seat and spent the first hour simply observing. Family members stopped by to chat. A few asked about my garden. Others commented on the beautiful weather. Everything felt pleasant on the surface. Yet beneath the polite smiles, I sensed an undercurrent of anticipation. Eventually, the conversation shifted exactly where Vanessa wanted it to go. It began innocently enough. Someone mentioned future plans. Another relative brought up retirement. Before long, discussions about property, long-term arrangements, and family responsibilities filled the room. Vanessa handled the transition smoothly. Too smoothly. She spoke about practicality, about preparing for the future, about ensuring that everyone was protected. Several people nodded along. Daniel added a few supportive comments. Then Vanessa turned toward me with a sympathetic smile and suggested that simplifying my living situation might be the smartest decision for everyone involved. The room grew quieter. Not silent, just attentive. Waiting. Watching. I noticed several relatives glance in my direction. Vanessa clearly expected me to respond the way I always had. Politely. Reluctantly. Perhaps even apologetically. Instead, I thanked her for her concern. Then I asked a question. I asked whether everyone present understood the facts being discussed or whether they were relying on assumptions. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations paused. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly. Daniel looked confused. For the first time all afternoon, neither of them seemed fully comfortable. I reached beside my chair and retrieved the leather folder I had brought with me. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. I simply opened it and placed several documents on the table. Richard had prepared everything carefully. Clear summaries. Relevant records. Copies of provisions that had existed for years but had apparently escaped everyone's attention. I explained that my late husband had established specific protections regarding family assets and future distributions. I explained that certain decisions remained entirely under my control. Most importantly, I explained that many assumptions circulating within the family had no legal or financial basis whatsoever. As I spoke, expressions around the room began to change. Confusion gave way to surprise. Surprise gave way to understanding. Vanessa attempted to interrupt twice. Each time she stopped when she realized the documents spoke more clearly than any argument could. Daniel picked up one of the pages and read it silently. The color drained from his face. Not because anyone had embarrassed him, because reality rarely asks permission before arriving. For several seconds, no one spoke. The room that had once echoed with confident predictions now felt remarkably quiet. I looked around at the people seated there and felt something unexpected. Relief. Not victory. Relief. The burden of pretending had finally disappeared. I closed the folder and stood. Then I said the only thing that truly mattered. I told them that respect could never be inherited, transferred, or assumed. It had to be earned. After that, I wished everyone a pleasant afternoon. And for the first time in a very long time, I walked away without feeling the need to explain myself to anyone.